1 o'clock. We good to go online? Okay, perfect. It is 1 o'clock. Welcome back, everybody. Hardest presentation after lunch. So this panel is going to discuss WECC's intentionally elevated oversight approach, starting with the WECC Oversight Strategy all the way through our oversight planning and monitoring activities. We've done this intentionally to make sure that it's a one-WECC approach. And so when we say one-WECC, we mean including RAPA, CMEP, all parts of WECC together. And so the panel today, we're welcoming back Greg Park. So you'll see the one-WECC approach there. We've got Michael Delbout from Enforcement, Stacia Karen from Entity Monitoring, Patrick Van Gilder from Oversight Planning, and Kathy Bach from Oversight Planning as well. Steve Noss, our VP, is going to kick us off, and I hope you enjoy this panel today. Thanks.
All right, good afternoon. I hope everyone had a good lunch. I'm pretty excited about this panel in particular because I think whether you've been doing this work for 4 months or 14 years, you should be able to get something out of it. We're really excited about the trajectory that we've had over the last couple of years in terms of thinking critically about the work we do, how we do the work, how we engage with entities, and really how we, philosophically should be doing our oversight work. And so we want to talk about that a little bit with all of you today. I think it's perfect and an excellent segue that we had the discussion about risk before lunch. And I thank Greg for joining us as well with the rest of the oversight professionals we have here. Because I think that's central to some of the things that we're doing. We think that we should be aligned in our view as WECC about what risks there are in the Western Interconnection and have that drive in conjunction with regulatory priorities that are articulated in our CMEP implementation plan, the type of view that we do from an oversight perspective. We've been doing this in some form, at least from a mandatory and enforceable form, since 2007. I wasn't here when 2007 hit, but I know there were some in the room. Anybody been doing this work since 2007 or before? There's a handful, of course. And then what we learned, I think, in those initial years is that we set up our program to be very schedule-based, and we had very static sets of requirements that were monitored. We called it an actively monitored list. And we literally had a rotation of entities that we would audit. So it wasn't very risk-informed. It wasn't risk-based at all. And throughout the early part of the 2010s, culminating in 2014, we shifted to what we called a risk-based compliance monitoring and enforcement program. It was through the result of what was then called the Reliability Assurance Initiative. And that's a representation to me of the pendulum swinging way out the other way as well. And so that began, the very mechanical work of a bottoms-up view of each and every entity. And we would develop essentially this dossier-based approach of what we thought we knew about every single entity that was registered. And that's just not something that's sustainable over time either. And so I think we're trying to, continue to enhance to get to kind of a more of a right size approach in terms of how we think about our oversight. And it starts with the higher level risk. It starts with overlaying our regulatory priorities based on what's going on with those risks and what standards and requirements apply for them. And it's really meant to tailor what we do into how we interact with entities. But before I get too much further, though, too, I want to pause and have a really fundamental discussion about the difference between the jurisdiction to write noncompliance and enforce standards compared to WECC's obligation under our delegation agreement and the rules of procedure to understand the landscape of how well entities are capable of meeting the responsibilities that we have jurisdiction to write noncompliances for. Because we always get we get in this argument and have historically for a long time, where some entities and some people say, well, you can't ask me about my program. You can't talk to me about my controls because you can't write a non-compliance about that. Okay, well, fine. But then when I leave that interaction, what does that tell me? What confidence does that give me? What assurance does that give me about that entity's ability to do what they're supposed to, how well their program is designed, how connected their management is and the tone at the top, how strong their controls are to prevent that non-compliance. We have data even that suggests, that some entities are very capable of finding and self-reporting non-compliance. Other entities rely almost exclusively on us to find their non-compliance. All of those things should matter. We clearly only have the jurisdiction to write a non-compliance and to pursue enforcement for things that are articulated in the standards themselves. That's true. But we have an obligation as a regulatory entity to make sure that we understand and make an assessment of our opinion about that entity's capability to do what they're supposed to. And with that view in mind, that's kind of what shapes, our ongoing work in terms of how we make decisions about how soon and with what frequency and with what depth we want to return to particular entities to look closer and apply a different level of scrutiny compared to, in some cases, relying on the very strong program and foundations that they've built to give us assurance to allow us to apply a different level of scrutiny. And that's what we're going to talk about here a bit today. And so I just wanted to make that distinction. We're moving from what was an actively monitored list, a very rote, simple, but non-risk informed and non-flexible approach, transitioning over to what I would argue should have always been the case. Way back in 2009, FERC issued an order that provided guidance for conducting compliance audits to the ERO and to regional entities. And it was in that order that they made a statement that the compliance audits under the Compliance Monitoring and Enforcement Program shall be based on professional auditing standards. And professional auditing standards require that we understand the entity, their control environment, how they're responding to the things that they're responsible for doing. And so we take that obligation seriously. And with that in mind, we've done a lot of work to enhance our oversight view in a very holistic manner. So hopefully that backdrop helps, but I'll turn it over to Kathy now to guide the panel through. But we are looking forward to a good conversation and exciting conversations to follow as well.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. We all ready for a nap? I know I am. That's what lunch actually gears me towards. So thank you for coming back and being alert enough. I think we're all really excited to discuss, how we're going to work together as one WECC to address this risk. We're going to walk through the process of how we will take a risk, and each risk that is identified will go through a similar process. Keeping in mind that this is not a specific schedule base, we will be assessing risk or where we need to shift our focus periodically. So this is an ongoing process. So I'm going to start with Greg. Based on your discussion around grid transformation and the risk management process, how do you view that we plan for areas of risk that we want to observe?
So risk management is really focusing on really quantifying the level of risk. And I think what's really becoming very, very apparent to me is if you go back just a few years ago, especially if you start talking about the 901 order and IBRs, everything was done with a peanut butter knife and bread. And IBRs impacted everybody. But as we start digging in and looking at the data, I think there's only about 5 or 6 balancing authorities that are integrating batteries as an example. There's only X amount of entities integrating wind. We've seen through the data that we have that the risk is not equally spread among all of the similar types of entities. And we really need to start looking at regional impacts based on what is going on in that specific area. And our data is really going to be really important to drive that oversight strategy. It doesn't make any sense to start talking about a whole bunch of solar to be to an entity that has no IBR, PV facilities, or even wind facilities. So a lot of the Order 901 stuff, why would we spend the time to go audit or build an oversight strategy for that type of entity with if they don't have those types of resources that are being impacted? So I think that for me, that's a big input to this whole strategy is we really need to tailor it, not just the risk to the interconnection, but the risk to the entity itself. So I think that's the way I look at it.
Thank you, Greg. Patrick, I'd like to kind of hear it from how you think that blends in when we're talking about oversight planning and the monitoring aspect of it.
Thanks, Catherine. The oversight strategy that the RSO team develops is based on a lot of different inputs, and one of those is the risk register and the risk management process that WECC has, along with our CMEP-IP, our regulatory priorities. So there's a lot of information in there that feeds into opportunities for us to identify risks that we want to take a look at. We have to make some sort of plan, and it's our strategy to do so. It's a multi-year approach. Some risks may be identified and addressed within the year, and others may take multiple years to address. So we're going to evaluate these risks and regulatory priorities, determine focus areas we want to look at. These priorities are aligned with our holistic risk treatment strategy. So an example of that from a big picture might be like grid transformation is going to be on our oversight strategy for a given year.
And I'll just add that one of the values that entity monitoring brings to identifying risks is that we are out engaging entities with these monitoring engagements. And so we are having very candid conversations about what entities are encountering, what risks they are seeing, what deficiencies they're seeing in their systems. So we are taking all of that information back and handing it over to oversight planning to inform these new and emerging risks as we go.
Thank you. Okay, as we move into the targeted risk areas that we've been discussing, how do we determine what areas of risk that we're going to observe?
So yeah, the oversight planning team is going to lead this effort, but we're going to do this in collaboration with every other RSO team member, the enforcement, registration, certification, entity monitoring, and we need to work closely with our RAPA counterparts as well, all the groups there. So we have that one WECC approach to understand which risks we're going to target for that oversight engagement. So the oversight strategy is going to be our guide for determining which risks we want to look at that are impacting the Western interconnection. And this is not going to be focused at one entity at a time. So we're not looking at one NCR at a time. We're going to focus our approach from the risk level. So this is more of a top-down view where we're going to look at the risk first and then determine what we're going to do with it. So this could be based on functional registration. So we could have a BA problem like we discussed earlier today. It could be a footprint of an entity. It could be a certain type of technology or a geographical area. Greg talked about this morning where we had the Western interconnection broken up into several sections of geographical areas, and it could pertain to just one of those. So as a team, we'll decide which specific risks we want to look at. And using the oversight strategy example I had before of grid transformation, something like modeling large loads could be a subset of that grid transformation area.
I'll just expand a little bit on what Patrick was talking about. Probably a good example of that is, I mentioned it earlier in my presentation, but we've been really diligent about making sure the data that we're collecting is usable across the organization. And in our reliability assessments, hopefully everybody's aware, but we do several that are either regional or national, the LTRA at NERC. And we've built those to identify the areas that are very unique. And I think that'll probably be beneficial in this oversight in targeting risks. I'll take the LTRA as an example. If we have an area of the interconnection that is showing to be resource deficiency in a certain year, there's definitely some standards and some oversight that needs to be done in those areas that probably doesn't make sense for other areas of the interconnection. So using not just the data we have, but also the assessments that we do, I think is going to be really, really important to inform the oversight strategy on what really needs to be in focus for specific risks. So.
Thank you. Any other panelists?
One thing I want to impress, I think, upon everybody is one thing we're trying to do is be more nimble in some respects. And so the momentum of the last several years, last almost 2 decades, has been really audit focused, and we have a lot more tools available to us. An audit is still important, and there's still some sense of regularity with some of the highest inherent risk entities, because at its core, by virtue of them having that very high inherent risk, and we do feel continued obligation to make sure that we're having a regular and meaningful engagement with them, usually through an audit. But in conjunction with what Greg and Patrick just talked about, some things start to emerge a little bit faster than that, whether it's risk focused from a region, an area, or a type of activity, or whether it's brought on by our view and assessment of the strength of the entity's program. We're starting to use some of our tools like spot checks and self-certs with additional requests for information and evidence more frequently, more quickly, in response to these things that we see. And so they're going to kind of happen in parallel in that regard. We very seriously talk about our assessment of an entity after we have an engagement with them. And depending on our assessment of their program, and again, this isn't about whether they were compliant or not, but just our confidence and assurance in their ability to understand what they're supposed to do, how they assure their reliability related requirements are occurring, can prompt us to follow up in 6 months or 9 months with a spot check. So too with the growing number of new registrants. We have, I believe, right around 490 plus or minus a few entities who are registered in the United States right now in WECC. And on May 15th, all of the Category 2 IBRs are going to be registered, about 150 of those. And so very quickly, we're going to be knocking on the door of 700 registered entities. So it's not practical to layer on a compliance audit, the 270-day notice that entails, and all of the extensive planning that happens for that. And so we instead want to have interaction to get the pulse of what's going on quicker. And in fact, every new registrant today has a spot check from WECC within 90 days of their registration. That's occurring right now. And that's so that we can make sure we understand early the ability and capability of those entities to do what's required of them. So I just wanted to bring that in, that there's this kind of parallel of nimbleness happening. The audits of the highest inherent risk in particular aren't stopping. We have a flexibility to adjust how we do those based on our assessment and confidence in their programs. But all of this gets tailored. And we want to be able to act quicker with more of our tools more frequently so that we can make sure we're being responsive to these risks.
And Kathy, before we go on to the next question, I think a good example of implementation of this concept is we recently in the past year and a half sent out hundreds of self-certifications dealing with cold weather preparedness and CIPLO impact, specifically TCAs and RMs and physical security. And we followed up with at least a dozen of those self-certs with spot checks just to go in and see what was really happening. And we found some issues. We found that there were some entities that didn't fully understand what the standard was requiring of them. And so that's one of the reasons why we're taking this approach, is we want to get more granular in these risks that we're identifying interconnection wide.
Thank you. And I think to your comment, Steve, it kind of leads into our next topic of objectives and how we as WECC can help better understand how the risks are being mitigated in the interconnection. I don't know which panelists would like to take that first.
I can, Kathy. So once again, the oversight planning team will lead this effort, but we're going to do this in collaboration with everyone else again. And we want to align these objectives with our targeted risk area that we've chosen. And there could be one or more objective associated with this targeted risk area, but it's not going to be an objective, like we said, based on one entity or one particular registered function. It's going to be designed to assess those entities that are impacting that risk, how they are operating, maintaining, planning, and securing the Western interconnection, their Western interconnection assets. So the goal is to identify the residual risk of what remains after the risk exists and the entities have controls in place to address these unmitigated risks. So once again, this is in collaboration with the rest of the oversight teams and the RAPA teams. We're really looking to understand and influence entity behaviors on how they're addressing these unmitigated risk.
Yeah, and entity monitoring, we work collaboratively with oversight planning and enforcement and mitigation to ensure that information that we see during our monitoring engagements around mitigation are communicated. And if we are seeing high levels of residual risk due to ineffective or non-existent controls, we communicate that across all teams represented at this table to ensure that we're capturing those risks.
And excuse me, I think this is where the work of enforcement really comes into this picture, is because we're talking about mitigating the risks that we now know about. So if through the process, as Greg's described, we've identified the risks, and then Patrick's put it into scope, and then as Stacia mentioned, we're now like looked for it, and we've gone out and we've tried to monitor it. If you haven't caught on and we haven't communicated that we need that risk resolved by then, and you do make it into the enforcement realm, we're going to make sure through the mitigation process that we resolve those risks and that we do our duty to the reliability and make sure that those risks don't come up again, which was really what the standards were made for in the first place following the original blackout, is that things we know that can be prevented, we're going to have to make sure that they get prevented. So if it comes to the enforcement, we're going to make sure that those mitigation steps are followed. And if it's a targeted risk area, you may find even more enhanced mitigation or more attention to the to your mitigation steps. And as Steve pointed out right at the beginning, this is where the controls come in. So although the controls may not be written into the standard, the enforcement process is designed to make sure that things don't happen again, right? It's to make sure that we don't have a recurrence of that non-compliance. And that's where the controls really come into play, because without those controls in play, there's probably a very good chance that you'll have the same thing happen again if you don't look at the root cause. So that's where this whole circle comes back together. The risk gets identified, it gets moved through the chain, and we finished out that targeting that same risk area to make sure it gets resolved for the purpose of reliability.
So I'll just add one additional item to it. As we start maturing our RMP 2.0, we're going to start wanting to identify that we're actually moving the target, right? And I don't know how else we do that without feedback from this whole strategy. We don't have a lot of tools to actually adjust our risks in our risk management program. We're going to quantify what they are, But I think this feedback is going to be very, very valuable to really see if we're moving the needle on risks that are impacting reliability in the Western interconnection.
Thank you. So I know we've kind of touched upon that, how we see it in the future is not this set schedule based. And there could be someone that we may have several interactions in 1 year. Maybe someone else we don't see for a year or two. This is for all panelists, but I think this is geared heavily towards Stacia and Patrick, but anybody please jump in if you'd like to add, is how do we see us selecting what entities are for oversight?
Okay, well, I'll start. So first we have our risk identified, right? And then we move on to identifying the entities, and we take into consideration a lot of different criteria. First, are we looking at targeting registered functions? Are we looking at a geographical area, a location where these risks are higher, a BA area? Are there specific entities that are really impacted or could be impacted by this emerging threat or concern? We look at all of that to determine which entities are the most critical to visit first.
Yeah, so we've already collected a lot of information about entities, and we know various controls and history and enforcement backgrounds. We're also going to consider the rules of procedure. We know entities currently today that are registered as an RC, a BA, or a TOB have to be looked at every 3 years. So that is always going to be a consideration until that is no longer a requirement. So any emerging concerns we want to look at as well. We have a lot of performance history on these entities, and some of that we do get from registration and certification activities. So we can feed that into which entities we need to look at. We really want to look at the entities that have a bigger impact that maybe we don't know as much about their history and their performance for this risk.
So I heard you mention enforcement. So I'm wondering if Michael, is there anything you'd like to add before we move on? Patrick mentioned the word enforcement. So I didn't know if you'd like to add something to this before we moved on. If not, that's totally fine. Okay. So because, we are taking this approach and we're going to work across these different areas with each other to ensure that it's being mitigated on a risk we've identified. How do each of you see, how will you determine to know what the best engagement will be for a selected entity?
Okay, so at this point in our process, we have the risk identified. We have the entity identified, and now we have to figure out how we're going to monitor them. So at WECC, we have a lot of tools at our disposal. And the 3 most common are audit, spot check, and self-certification. And any of these can be used, but it depends on who we're interacting with and what risk is involved here. So when it comes to audits typically have a longer planning horizon if it's a planned audit. And we notify entities 270 days prior of the audit of our intent to audit them. So typically an audit would be used to obtain assurance that an entity is mitigating regulatory priorities. And then a spot check has a shorter planning horizon. So we would typically use this method to obtain an assurance that an entity is mitigating emerging residual risks. Something that we should be considering and visiting and checking in on in a shorter time period. And then we have self-certifications. And these motivate entity introspection and action on regulatory priorities, and they help us get a pulse check from a large group of entities. Typically, we send self-certifications out in batches so we can understand really what is going on out in the interconnection and what we should be focusing on further. And with all of these types of monitoring engagements, we work very, very closely with all of RSO, but especially WECC's Oversight and Analysis and Administration team, Angie Shapiro's team, to schedule and monitor, to schedule these monitoring engagements.
So depending on the risk area, it may depend on which type of engagement we're looking at. If the risk area is associated with something that is not applicable to a reliability standard, we may choose outreach. It could depend on the functional registration, what we know about the entities. It could depend on a lot of different things, maybe a previous registration and certification activities that have occurred. So we also want to coordinate this with enforcement, because they have oversight activities that they've performed with entities, and the RAPA team, because they also do activities where they engage with entities, and we want to learn that information as well. We don't want to duplicate efforts, and we also want to ensure we communicate with each other what we're working on.
I'll just add a little bit on one of the things that RAPA is really working on our side, and that's making sure we understand and communicate to our RSO teams the level of engagement that we get in our activities. So we do a lot of data collection activities, we do a lot of event analysis activities, situational awareness, and then of course reliability assessments. All that is really, I think, going to be communicated across the board to the oversight activities to really make sure that as these things are, the information we have on the RAPA side is really communicated well. So I think we find we have different perspectives of the cultures that we interact with because of that, and I think we're trying to make sure we're communicating that all the way across the organization well.
Yeah, and I'll build on that a little bit. In the past, enforcement was very much we would just take whatever the PNCs were found by monitoring and receive them, and then we'd go out and get rid of them, and that would be the end of our work. What we're doing now is communicating a lot more in the circle, as you've described it. Like, so what we're finding goes back up to Patrick's team, and they'll look at the risk of that class of entities or whatever and take that into consideration. And all of this stuff comes back around again in terms of the circle of what we're looking at to make sure we're focused. And so where that makes a difference for us is that when these things came in before, we would just say, oh, this is just a one-off, it's just this standard, and we'd move it on its way. But now we'll start looking at those as a group, maybe seeing what the risks are, what the root cause of those were together, passing those back to Greg and Patrick's team, and then making changes in their monitoring approach based on those outputs. So I think that's the big difference now, that there's integrity to what each of the groups is doing that interacts with the other ones.
So what we're discussing here are oversight activities associated with that one oversight objective. We can have multiple oversight objectives for a targeted risk area, and we can also have multiple targeted risk areas going on at the same time, which means an entity could be subjected to multiple oversight activities in the same year. It doesn't mean we're going to necessarily audit the same entity 5 times 1 year, but we may have an audit associated with multiple objectives. We're going to try to consolidate those, but if an entity isn't up for audit that year and outreach makes the most sense, you could be contacted by WECC numerous times in 1 year to participate in one of these oversight tools to help us, address our oversight activities, because the oversight activities are what is helping us understand how to meet that objective.
Thank you. So when we talk about scope, I think that's always been kind of viewed as what's the standard and requirement you're going to look at for me? And if we think beyond that, and that our conversations and interactions are not going to be limited to just a standard and requirement, and Steve, you're welcome to, if you have any insight for us, jump in as well. I'd like to put that out for the entire panel.
Yeah, so when it comes to scoping, we've identified risks and we've identified the objective of why we are going to a monitoring engagement, right? Now, these risks don't always fit neatly into a standard. So when we're having conversations, don't be surprised if on a monitoring engagement, we are talking about things on the outskirt of a standard, because we are trying to get to the risk and to see if your entity is prepared and if your entity can help support the reliability of the electric grid. So while we will have a scope of standards, we will be having conversations that could potentially not quite fit into that scope of standards. We are addressing the risks at monitoring engagements.
Some of our scopes may be addressing the purpose of the standard as well, not necessarily a specific requirement. So if we start looking at the purpose is great. And I think we've overlooked that too many times, where it tells us why that standard is in effect. And that why could be very related to a risk that we want to address. So a lot of this is going to be controls, discussions, activities that the entity performs. We're also going to consider a lot of the history that these entities have, what they're registered, what their inherent risk level is. And we want to make sure that we're also aligned with what's the activities happening in enforcement and with the in RAPA as well, so we don't duplicate that work also.
Just to weigh in a little bit on scope, I think scope by itself is just only part of the conversation. And it's an area that, you know, I feel like we've been talking about in some respects for, 10 years. What I would encourage people to do is think about your scope as your opportunity to showcase and share what you're doing with regard to your program, your controls, your ability to prevent noncompliance in the first place, how effective you are at detecting when there is noncompliance, and how fast you can remediate it. Because the scope just tells part of the story. It tells the subject matter of the discussions that our monitoring teams are going to have. But the discussions that they're going to have are so different depending on an entity's capability. And, we are getting really good at having those conversations to see and determine whether we have any semblance of confidence that they know that they're capable of doing what's required by that requirement, compared to perhaps, just getting lucky or not having a non-compliance. And that can shape the subsequent activities that occur. It can shape the time that we're on site, if we are on site. It can shape the determination to go on site. So many things can be shaped by the conversations that happen within the umbrella of scope that changes the scrutiny that we apply to try to give ourselves a level of assurance. And even then, after an activity is ended, we have our monitoring team in particular, because they interact so directly with entities, have an incredibly broad perspective of dealing with dozens and dozens and dozens of entities over a couple of years. So their experience also weighs into the assessments that we make about that entity's capability, which then goes back into inform whether we want to come back out and see this entity again through maybe a more targeted or tailored spot check. So anyway, I would just encourage people, when you look at scope, that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's so much underneath the umbrella of scope that I feel like it's almost a loaded word at this point. It's really your opportunity to inventory for yourselves and share those indicators of effectiveness that we're going to be looking for in making our follow-on decisions.
So I think with all this work that's being conversations internally, and then once, the monitoring teams and different areas of engagements that will occur, how can we add feedback and value back to the registered entities after interactions or when we've looked at a risk?
So for entity monitoring, there are some built-in feedback loops here. So we have opening and closing presentations. We have end of the day debriefs, the end of engagement survey, where we are asking for information from you guys. We have the audit report or the spot check report. We have a 90-day call that happens 90 days after a spot check or an audit has concluded. And then also, I think it's just natural that we are giving feedback through our conversations and interviews, just throughout our interactions. But those would be like the more formal ways of giving feedback would be the presentations and the reports and the observations, the recommendations, areas of concern, positive observations, those types of things.
I would encourage entities that are part of an oversight activity that has an oversight objective associated with it to request feedback from WECC on how they may or may not be meeting that objective. So if you don't hear from us on that, please reach out and say, hey, I was part of this engagement. It had this objective. Are we doing well with it? Are we meeting it? Are we not meeting it? And we should be able to give you some sort of assessment. It might not be immediate, but we should be able to do some analysis to determine how well we think each entity is participating.
Yeah, and again, this is a change for enforcement. We're part of the monitoring process now. So if there is a finding during an audit or a spot check or something like that, we would have a collaboration right at the moment. In fact, we started a new process within WECC this last year for the audit leaders to reach out to us directly in enforcement, have that conversation right there, right then, to make sure that you get good feedback of that by the end of the audit. And if there is a PNC, what's a better feedback loop than the engagement of enforcement, right? We'll make sure we get you the feedback you need to get that fixed. So if we go down that route, we'll certainly get you the engagement feedback that you need.
Craig, do you have anything to add from your perspective on that?
So we've developed a recommended action guide at WECC, and it's an internal document that really is going to identify what magnitude of industry interaction we're going to take. And I think we're going to use oversight to really feed into that process. If there's a identified problem that is more than one entity specific, we need to take action. And our recommended action guide is really going to help us identify what that action may be. It can be everything from very targeted to industry-wide alerts that go out. So we really haven't had a holistic, well-documented approach on how we're doing that, and that was developed in the last year. So I think that's probably going to be the number one thing from the WECC side that's going to be really, it's going to take in all this information. If there's a need to communicate out, I think we're going to do that in a very organized and comprehensive way. So,
Thank you. So we discussed how that external feedback will look, but because this is a continual process, we're going to have to always be looking at and assessing our risk. How do we see those within WECC for each other? How do we see that communication and that loop so that we can ensure that we're closing the loop, we're getting the feedback, we're having the right engagement?
Yeah, so when entity monitoring comes back from a monitoring engagement, we work collaboratively with enforcement and with oversight planning. So there is that feedback loop where we're taking all the information that we gathered and we're passing it on internally with the status of those oversight objectives. And we do this because if there is any level of residual risk due to ineffective or non-existent controls, we want to make sure that we communicate that so we can follow up on it in the future, that we're not just leaving risk out there on the table.
Yeah, and the goal of this is any activity that we have, we want to ensure we communicate that within WECC, so WECC is all informed of these activities and the results of these activities. Much like after a certification review, we need to understand how the entity performed during that certification review so that can feed into our processes going forward. And the goal, like there at the bottom, it says the goal is for residual risk to understand how those entities are meeting that residual risk.
Yeah, I think what you'll start seeing is more of our insights that we're gathering at each phase informing the other parts of the operation. As you said, nothing will be left. And so if it moves on to us, we'll make sure that we track it down. And if it doesn't wind up with us, it'll go to someone else and will be tracked down another way. But we won't just walk away and leave risks unattended to.
And I think I'll go back to the risk management process. It's going to be really, really important that the RMP takes that into consideration. If we're not moving the needle, we have to be very proactive and maybe change strategy. So that feedback into the RMP process, the risk management process, is going to be really, really key as our program matures. There's only a few things that we use to measure success, and I think this is going to be one of the main ones to identify that we are mitigating risk, that we're reducing the risk to reliability in the bulk power system.
Okay, thank you. We'd like to save some time for questions, but before we do, I want to make sure as we're closing this up, what would be some top key takeaways that we ensure that we have communicated today? Greg?
Well, I'll start with the risk register, of course. So we are dramatically changing how we're communicating risks at WECC. The old process was a 2-year stakeholder-led process. The risk register is brand new, and we're really will in the next several months be driving out the maturity of that product. But I think it's really important that everybody understands that the risk management process is central to everything we're doing at WECC. If we don't properly mitigate these risks, we have to identify them, build treatment plans around them, if we're ever going to try to mitigate some of these major risks. I think IBR is a really good one to look back on with really good clarity. Blue Cut was in 2016, and we're finally getting standards today. So that's not really nimble. So one of the purposes of the risk register is really to inform both WECC and the industry on what we believe the risks are, and that we're making progress on mitigating those risks through treatment plans.
I would say from an overarching perspective, what you're going to see is, like I said, a more responsive, nimble, engaged regulator. That's our intent. Nothing has changed in NERC's rules of procedure related to compliance monitoring and enforcement. Nothing has been modified. We think that we're elevating and enhancing our thought processes around what we've always been required to do, and that is what we're doing. And what I mean by us being more engaged and nimble and responsive is that I think you're going to see us having more activities, in particular with what we characterize as medium inherent risk and small inherent risk entities. First of all, we have a growth in the number of the small inherent risk entities, and that's great. There's a lot of good things happening on the grid, a lot of new participants. With that comes what we feel is our responsibility to make sure that in the aggregate there's understanding of what needs to happen, what needs to be done, and so we're going to be looking for indicators and trends and trying to find where necessary areas that may need more intervention if there is some confusion about what the responsibilities are for some of those smaller entities. But it kind of used to be the joke 10 years ago that if they were this low inherent risk entity to the grid, they probably weren't going to be seen very much because we were focusing all of our attention on the higher inherent risk entities. Well, we'll know more. And then with the medium inherent risk entities, we're seeing also incredible transformation occurring within individual companies. That's a very positive thing for what's going on to help address resource adequacy issues and questions, but also calls into question the ability of their programs to keep pace commensurate with their grid impact growth. And so we're watching for that too. So all in all, to me, I think this represents a commitment by us to make sure that we're using this holistic top-down risk approach as a basis for guiding our activities, and then taking prompts from the entities that we engage with to tailor all of those activities responsively to the capabilities that they're willing to share with us. So that'd be my takeaway.
My takeaway would be to plan on having a follow-up on recommendations, areas of concern, and PNCs. So one thing that we've had a lot of success with in the past is a 90-day post-audit or spot check call. And typically we have just offered that as an option to entities. Starting now, we're actually going to just automatically schedule it because we've had such great conversations with entities during that call about what they're doing to mitigate some of the risks that we found at audit. So that is something that you can expect in the future.
My takeaway would be that do your own self-risk assessment. Understand where the risks are in your own footprint, especially where we may have overlooked, and Steve touched on a little bit, is that aggregation. If you have entities in your footprint for larger entities that have smaller entities that may aggregate to a bigger problem, large loads could be an issue, IBRs could be an issue. Understand those risks as well, but do your own risk assessment because we're going to be asking to see that.
Yeah, and I would just, I guess from an enforcement perspective, we're going from isolated individual compliance activities to integrated activities, I think is a big part of this, right? We're trying to make sure that each part is informed by the other parts and that they're all making, I guess I'll use this term, operational excellence together, and that they're working together in a way that provides value to you. And part of that is making sure that we're utilizing the enforcement process to create the right impacts that we want to create across the system, not just in terms of shaping each individual PNC as it goes through, but the whole discouragement of future violations in that sense. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that, but putting this all together from the identification of the risk to the closing out of the risk, I think what you'll see is that trying to be just a lot more effective at making sure that we mitigate the risks that we know to the system, and by working together. And I would say this is coincidentally this month, Kathy and I have been at WECC 17 years this month.
Yes.
So in that 17 years, I would tell you when we first got there, the self-reports were coming through the fax machines. They were being put in manila folders. We were passing them from desk to desk and trying to put them on other people's desks. We kept the ROPs in 3-ring binders. Things have changed a lot. And this is a continuing, I think, evolution of that and a continuous improvement of that, where we're finding out ways to work together. I think many of you know the stories that we used to have literally a brick wall that would separate the RAPA group from the compliance group, and we didn't even allow their badges to flash into our area. So, you know, and in fact, when I first started at WECC, I went down and Steve Ashbaker had a lot of Yankee stuff in his room. And I said, well, I'm going to go talk to him. And somebody said, you can't talk to him. I said, but he's a fellow Yankees fan. How I can go right in? We'll have a lot to talk about. And they, no, you can't do that. But we can now. And it's a very different WECC. It's a different challenges as we learned about the grid enforcement. I think we're just evolving to meet those challenges. And I think that's my big takeaway of and looking forward to what the rest of the year and the years ahead bring.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you, panelists. I think we have just a couple minutes for any questions that someone may have.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ruchisha. I'm with AES. Great discussion. Thank you for sharing all this insight. I just have a handful of questions, starting with risk. How would entities know what is WECC's risk focus for a given year or for a certain time? If there is one or there will be multiple, where would we learn about it?
I think a good starting point would be to be in tune with our risk management process. So that's going to be the starting point for identifying the global risks that we see as WECC. Because I think one really good benefit about that is that we don't view it as, you know, a part of the company or another, right? So we say this is the risk, and so now let's say what what are the different tools that we have available going to do about it? What is oversight going to do to help support that risk? What is events analysis going to do to support that risk? What is, what kind of assessments might we do or build into the WERA, for example? What are we going to do in concert to address that risk? And then another one that I always turn to really closely is the CMEP implementation plan. And Eric, that takes input from all those different sources. But I've started to say that it has an unfortunate name in the implementation plan. It really represents to me what I would consider our regulatory priorities. So those are the things that if you're looking at the risks facing WECC articulated in the risk management plan, risk management program, and you look at the focus areas that we've identified in our regulatory priorities, that should tell you where you're putting additional emphasis and see how your operations match up to that. And then, I think the recommendation earlier to do your own assessment too about where you're stronger or where you're weaker would also benefit because people are different, the entities are different.
Thank you, Steve. That's helpful. So following up on that, when we look at CMEP, IP, RISC, risk register that WECC puts out, we see I see two kinds of risks. One is forward-looking, where a standard is not in place, but we all know, like large load modeling, that this is a risk area. We all are learning together how to mitigate this risk. And then there are others which are more of existing risk, like IBR. That's an existing known risk that we all, at least I feel that we are gaining traction on mitigating that risk. So from an oversight perspective, what's the focus? Because if we are focusing on future risks, the platform seems limited to talk about it. We want more answers from the regulators on mitigating that risk. So is that still oversight is still a platform for monitoring that risk, or do we have other platforms through which there's more collaboration and more learning opportunities before we talk about how does registered entities mitigate this risk?
I would say your risk assessment will tell you where you need to focus your efforts. And once we start engaging in entities from this top-down approach, which we kind of have already, those objectives are going to be probably spread pretty common. Everybody's going to know about them, that is a focus we're looking at. We don't want you to focus on those individuals because it may be different for your entities than for other entities. You may be in a different footprint, different geographic location, different types of technology. So it's really going to be way different from a one size fits all. It's going to be looking at that risk instead of one NCR. So individually, you could see where your assets and your operations have an impact and make sure you have controls in place to address those things in the CMEP IP or the risk register. Risk register, has high ranks, right? High, medium, low. We're not going to start at the low, obviously. So those things that are higher risk in those areas are probably places we're going to want to look at first. Also, things we've looked at in the past that we may have a good handle on already that are still a risk, we probably won't focus on initially. We can't focus on everything all at once. So you're right. We do have to have a smaller focus, but it's going to be towards those unmitigated risks that we just don't know about.
Yeah, I agree. And thanks, Patrick.
And it's going to be forward-looking. It's not really going to be backward-looking, things we already know. So.
Yeah, and last point, it would be great if we can share our feedback, because if we do our self-risk assessment, we see that we have risk in certain areas, not in others, even though it's a ARO risk or a WECC risk. How do we give that feedback without an engagement, maybe other platforms through which we can provide our input? That'd be helpful to us. Maybe internal compliance program. I don't know what that looks like, but I'd love to get some more possibilities open up on that area. So I'll leave it there.
Well, I'd say during the oversight activities, share that feedback with us.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to try and get through these two possible questions if we can. I think we're very limited on time. So, and we could speak offline if we've run over time.
Then I'll go with the first question being, if entity reviews aren't set on a schedule kind of going forward, then how are entities expected to do their financial budgets? Because many of us do our budgets on a multi-year approach. And we know, for example, we have an audit in 3 years. And so we've got a budget for those resources and things of that nature. So if we're doing spot checks, which on the entity side of the house, and at least the entities I work with, are just as labor intensive as an audit, because you're going to look at the evidence. You're not just going to go, yes, I'm I'm compliant and check the box and move forward. You're going to look at your evidence. You're going to review that evidence, send it up, have it reviewed, make sure everybody's okay with the fact that we're saying, yes, we're compliant, then comply or respond to the notice. So how does that work from an entity's perspective, or how do you see the impact of that on entities, particularly financially?
Well, I'm not a CFO, but I would imagine they would carry it just like the cost if you didn't incur the cost of that year, right? When you just move it to the next year and then hold that, and because it could happen at any time, you always face the cost of.
Unfortunately, a lot of entities aren't able to carry over budgets. And so your budget at the end of the year, if you didn't use it, you lose it, sort of like government and PTO. So that's one of the impacts that we're going to have to consider and think about how we're going to be able to ensure that we are able to properly respond. The other component is if we're having discussions at the audits regarding things that aren't necessarily in scope of audit, being able to know those things in advance so we can ensure that we have the right people available and on site or wherever. A lot of guys or ladies are out on PTO and things like that. And if we know the scope of the audit, we're telling these teams that they have to be here. If we're going beyond that scope, may create some difficulty. So,
That is
things to
good
think
feedback. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Hi, Richard Shiflett, Kano Consultants. Thank you, Ruchi, for asking that first question. You took some of my thunder with that. But I am very interested to hear what visibility we will have into that risk register that you've discussed, and whether that's going to be promulgated out to the whole interconnection or not. But that's not my question. My question is more about changes within WECC necessarily. Since we do currently have this low, medium, high team approach to monitoring entities, now we're looking at a objective-based risk analysis. Is there a possibility of change in those teams, perhaps creating a team specifically dealing with IBRs, and that the technical skill sets required to delve into some of those? Are we talking about looking forward? Are we looking at a large load team? Just some thoughts of what WECC may be considering for the future.
Well, I will answer the risk register question because I think it's near and dear to what we're trying to do. Our goal is nothing is behind the curtain, and we are seeking as much industry feedback as possible into that process. It's a well-documented process. It's going to be fully data-driven, and if our data is wrong, we're asking for somebody to provide us better data. So as far as the risk register, wide open, nobody's behind the curtain, and we hope for better industry engagement on the analysis and the evaluation of it.
I would say for the internal structure of WECC, no changes. We do have teams already that look at specific risks like cold weather, and I would think the big change within WECC is the communication that the RSO team has internally and the RAPID team has with the RSO team. So we're going to communicate a lot more. So I think that's going to be the biggest change. They're going to understand where we see risk. We're going to understand where they see risk and how that's been mitigated, all within our rules, within the WECC. So we're not going to violate any of those data sharing agreements, but we need to make sure that it's a one-WECC approach so you don't get a different answer from Greg than you get from me. Right, Greg?
And I would add the current organization we have is largely to help facilitate having common kind of single points of contact for entities. And so where we end up having somebody fall, the prime benefit is going to be that same group of people that are largely working with those entities. I will add that we are obviously cognizant of the growth of the number of registrants related to IBRs, and that does have downstream impacts on the types and the numbers of activities that we have, and then the subsequent work related to our compliance coordinators, and then downstream and enforcement. So, a little bit separate to that, we are taking account of that in terms of FTE expansion for our proposed 2027 budget. I can't believe it's already almost 2027, but that's being analyzed and proposed as part of those drafts that are going to be published soon and seeking comment throughout this year.
Thank you.
Okay, I know we are past time, so thank you for your time. We'll step off stage here so the next presentation can start. If you have any other questions that you'd like to go over, please find one of us after. Thank you.